Welcome back to the Infamous Experiments podcast. Today I'm joined by special guests Katie and Darcy, and today we're chatting about the Stanford Prison Experiment. As always, references will be listed in the show notes for you guys, but with that out the way, we'll jump right in. So Katie, real quick, how would you summarize the Stanford Prison Experiment?
It's an experiment that involved volunteers who were assigned to be guards or prisoners to investigate how positions of authority influence people's behaviour. Ultimately, it was shut down because guards became abusive towards prisoners and the prisoners were having mental breakdowns.
And you, Darcy?
Pretty much how I would summarize it.
And it's also how the experimenters who conducted it presented it too. More specifically, Craig Haney and colleagues 1973 attributed the abusive behavior to their assigned roles as guards. I assume from your understanding of it that you didn't know the study's validity has been widely criticized, Darcy?
I've never heard of such criticisms, or any criticisms.
Yeah, well, as its validity as a science experiment is often criticized in a few major ways. When you also consider that the results were never published in a peer-reviewed journal, as Riker and Haslam 2012 pointed out, the supposed implications are hard to believe. The first criticism is of Philip Zimbardo's dual role as experiment director and prison warden. Haney and colleagues 1973 claimed that the guards' abusive behavior towards inmates was indicative of the influence of the power inherent in this role. But that's kind of questionable though, as illustrated by Banu Azizi and Mo Behedi 1975, who argued that the abusive behavior demonstrated by the guards was resultant of guidance from Zimbardo and colleagues. An example is provided by Riker and Haslam on page 4 of their 2006 paper. They quote Zimbardo's 1989 documentary on the experiment, in which he briefs the prison guards, telling them that you can create in the prisoners a notion of arbitrariness, that their life is totally controlled by us, and they'll have no privacy. They'll have no freedom of action. They can do nothing, say nothing that we don't permit. We're going to take away their individuality.
Said that.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty intense, right?
Oh God, bruh.
And clearly, if you're instructing the guards on how to behave, you can't claim their actions to be naturally linked to their role. Haney and colleagues on page 69 of their paper also claim that their prison was a psychologically compelling prison environment. However, Banu Azizi and Mo Behedi 1975 argue that the psychological factors were quite different, highlighting that the inmates knew they didn't commit a crime were actually allowed to ask to leave at any one time, as an example. Whilst another was the prison bars. In actual prison, the bars remind inmates of the need to separate themselves from a society of good people, whilst in their experiment they remind inmates that they are participants in honourable scientific research. How Zimbardo and colleagues could have mitigated this is unclear, yet it wasn't exactly a psychologically compelling prison environment. Now, those were just two of many arguments against the experiment's validity. There are more to discuss, but we just don't have the time. Overall, I just think it's kind of funny that Zimbardo was like, hey, this is what naturally happens when you put on a guard uniform, when he was literally telling the guards to strip inmates of their individuality. Even more crazy, though, is that they teach this in schools, too. Like, have you been taught it, Darcy?
Yeah, although my teachers never mentioned any of the stuff we've talked about today.
Yeah, and you'd think the criticisms would be important to mention, but it seems that people emphasize how the experiment displays the horrifying implications of being put in a position of authority over others. The results of the experiment aren't completely useless. As observed by Riker and Haslam 2006, it may still be useful in examining the effects of something like leadership on people's actions. But to claim, as Burton and colleagues 2019 do, on page 1307 of my uni textbook, that the study provides a powerful demonstration of the way roles structure people's behavior is kind of laughable. Anyway, what do you make of the experiment now?
Well, it's kind of bullshit, isn't it?
Yeah, it kind of is. And what a note to end on because time's up. But thanks everyone for listening and thanks for coming on the show, guys.
Thanks for having us little people in a coat.
Thanks so much, Brian.
Awesome. Keep an eye out for episode 7 of Infamous Experiments. It'll be uploaded next week and will be about the infamous psychology experiment, Harlow's Monkeys. I'll catch you all then.